Hello lovely people and welcome to the Art Hive, and in today's video I'm going to share with you just how I went about making up my watercolour palette, as well as offer some useful hints and tips on the best way to go about it. So the first thing that you'll need is an empty palette, and I'm using this one from Schminky, which I ordered from Amazon, and it's got room for 36 half pans. I also ordered some empty half pans which were just plastic, inexpensive, and I picked up a bag of these from Amazon too. So as you can see, I've already got this smaller palette with pre-prepared half pans in them, but my aim of today's video was to show you that you can actually put together all of these different odds and ends and make a really nice user-friendly convenient palette that you can go to a lot easier than trying to go to different tubes and different palettes and all sorts. So that was my aim, to make something really user-friendly and a lot easier than picking about different bits and pieces from tubes and whatnot. So the Schminky palette came with a swatch card inside, but obviously being that I'm using a mixture of different paints, this wasn't going to fit, so I made it my own. And I just did this using a piece of watercolour paper and setting it out much the same as the swatch card that was in the palette, so it matched up with all the little half pans. But I'm going to make my own swatch card, and I'm going to write on which paints I've put in which order at the end of the video, which you'll see later. So I think it's a really good idea to do a swatch card. You don't have to do that, but I think it's really good for when you're planning your artwork, and it gives you a good idea of what colours you've got and what different hues of the different colours as well, so it makes planning your paintings a lot easier. So my first tip for actually setting up your watercolour palette is to label each of the half pans, and this is obviously ideally done before you've got any wet paint in them. The ones that I'm going to start with are the ones that were in my old palette, so I've just taken those out and I'm just lining them up with the swatch card that I made and making sure that they're all labelled. The next thing I do is I'm taking out the paints that I've got, and these are two little tester packs of Daniel Smith paints, and I am just writing down the different ones that I've got and setting each paint up with a separate half pan. It's also important, I think, to arrange them as you want them to be in your palette. Now, different people have got different ideas of how to lay them out, and that's one of the nice things about customizing your own palette. You can lay them out as you want to. You're not restricted by how they come if you buy them pre-done. So some people like to organise them in rainbow colours or warm to cool colours, and other people might choose to put opaque colours on one side and transparent colours on the other side, but it's really up to you, and that's the beauty of it. I've decided to do the warm colours on the left hand side and the cooler colours on the right hand side, but whatever works for you is fine. The only disadvantage to doing this was that my Sharpie was quite thick, and the Daniel Smith paints that I was using didn't have numbers, so it was a bit tricky to write them on there, but you can code them with anything that you like, or even use like a finer pen. I did use this Sharpie pen because it's permanent, and obviously with watercolours they do tend to get wet, and the idea of labelling them is so that it's easy to identify if you need to replace them or refill them. So once I'd done all the labelling, it was time to rearrange them and fill the pans. So I started off filling it with the ones that were already dried, and then went on to do the ones that I hadn't done already. And my top tip for filling these little pans would be to squeeze a small amount into each corner to start with. So do sort of 4 squeezes, 1 into each corner, and then I would tap the little pan down onto the tabletop or the desk, so you're getting the paint into each of those 4 corners, and that also helps to get rid of any air bubbles. And what you'll also see me doing is stirring each pan with a cocktail stick. Now this again just helps to mix the paints, because sometimes when they come straight out of a tube they might have separated slightly, but it also helps to make sure that the paint is evenly distributed in that pan and prevents air bubbles, as well as get a nice neat pan at the end of it. So the reason that you don't want air bubbles is that if you do get an air bubble, and then when you add water once it's dry, that water can get in through the air bubble and can break up your paint in that pan. So if you do it with a cocktail stick, stir it up, tap it down, try and expel all those air bubbles and make sure it's as neat as possible, then that will prolong the life of that half pan. And I just did this for each of the pans as I went through, and once they're dry it gave a really neat result as well. Another important thing when you're filling your little pans up is to make sure that you tighten the seal on your tube so that you can reuse them, and make sure that you haven't got a lot of paint around the top of the tube as well. Now this is to make sure that first of all air doesn't get in, so it might dry out your paints, and also to make sure that the paint when it dries doesn't stick your lid shut, because then it's difficult to undo them and reuse the rest of the tube. So I think I did rearrange these a few times actually once I decided on the order, but as they came out into the half pans I did have a little rejig, which is why we leave doing the swatch card until the end, because then you've got that freedom to have a play about with it until you make your final decision. The other thing that I would say is it's important to make sure that you don't waste too much paint in your stirring process, so make sure that you scrape the end of that cocktail stick off on the half pan itself, because these paints are expensive and we don't want to waste them. So also use the little bit that gets stuck in the lid as well, and try and minimize any waste. I think putting them in pans does generally help reduce waste anyway, because you're less likely to squeeze out more than you need, and I think it's a really good idea to put them in the pans this way. So when I'm doing my swatch card here, you can see I've got 2 jars of water, and that will be another of my top tips. So you want your swatch card to be as clean and pure as possible. You don't want any contamination from other colours getting in there, and that would give you a false impression of what the actual colours are. So the idea with the 2 jars of water is that the one on the left is for cleaning your brush, and the one on the right is for rinsing it, so that should stay really clean. And you'll notice that as I go through the swatch card is that the one on the left gets dirty and the one on the right should stay clean, giving you nice clear crisp colours. So when I'm actually applying the colours onto the watercolour paper or the swatch card, I'm trying to do quite a rich colour on the left hand side of my rectangle, and then some clear water to the bottom right of that, and blend them together in the middle. And that really is to try and give you as much of a variation of that one colour or hue as you can. So as I said earlier, if you're planning a watercolour piece and you want to know what colours you're going to use, it's a really good idea to have a swatch card like this so that you can judge which colours go with which and what the actual end result's going to look like when it's dry. So it was during this process that I actually realised that I'd got some different paints to what I actually thought I had, because originally I'd ordered these Daniel Smith small samples quite a while ago, and my aim was to get a lot of different colours. But as I went through this swatch, I realised that they were drying really strangely, and it turns out that the darker colours that I chose in the darker set were actually a Primatech variation, and they have some really interesting granulating effects which I really didn't plan for, but I love all things art, so this is just something else that I'm going to be able to try, and maybe that's a topic for another video, the Primatech by Daniel Smith, because I'm not sure how they're going to react, how they're going to be so far as light fastness or permanence. So I've marked those at the end with a little red star, as you'll see. So not quite what I had in mind, but still exciting and gives me some opportunity for some more paintings later on. So as you can see, once they're dry, I've added the names or the numbers to the paints, and I've also put in which brand they come from. And there we are, just looking at the different realising that I've made a bit of a boo-boo with the Daniel Smith paints, but they're still in the palette. How long they'll stay in there I don't know, but I'm going to give them a try. But it's always useful to have the key as well on the front of that swatch card. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video and hope you found it useful. If you've liked it, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and I'll see you next week. Thanks for watching. Bye.